Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be talking about the number one draft strategy for the 2023 fantasy football season. Now, regardless of how you approach your draft, whether that be heavy RB, hero RB, or even zero RB, you can find success in fantasy football. There's not one singular draft strategy that 100% leads to success. We have found success with a multitude of strategies over the years, but what I wanted to go ahead and do on today's episode is give you guys my interpretation as to how I'm going to approach my draft based on how the current meta of fantasy football kind of resides. Now, as we continue throughout today's episode and I present multiple drafts and the statistics that I've gathered this offseason that justify my approach throughout said drafts, I of course want to put the emphasis on two things. Number one, I'm selecting the best available player throughout my draft. I'm not hard tunneling on a specific draft strategy. Even though you can find success with specific draft strategies, this one is more of, hey, I'm going to take the best available player because I want to set myself up for success for the entirety of the season. Because by the time I get to week 17, the roster that I have is going to look very different than the one that I drafted in August. Again, I want to have a strong core nucleus, a foundation of a roster that consists of a good quarterback and tight end. So I have positional advantages there. I want to have running backs and wide receivers that certainly are going to give me not only high upside, but are going to be depth plays for the entirety of the season. Now, before I talk about how I navigated through a couple of these drafts, I want to remind you guys, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season with the singular goal of trying to help you win a fantasy football championship. I mean, that's literally all we're trying to do. I'm trying to give you as much information as possible so that when you approach your 2023 fantasy football draft, you are making the most informed decision every single round. You're not panicking and you're leading yourself to success. Additionally, we've put out videos just this last weekend in regards to strength of schedule, variables that are extremely important, but often, overlooked in fantasy football. I'm trying to give you guys as much data as possible. Over the course of this week, we'll be going over multiple draft strategies. Obviously, we're going over the number one draft strategy as of today, but I'll be going over strategies like, hero RB, zero RB, and putting them to the test and giving you guys my analysis regarding those approaches. Now, additionally, besides this content that you'll have on this channel, if you guys want to gain an even bigger advantage upon your league mates this offseason, be sure to travel down to the description of the video and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, the promotion sits as such. If you go ahead and sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get that first-time deposit match up to $100, you're going to get my 2023 fantasy football draft guide and rankings. This draft guide is hundreds of hours of data and statistics that I've gathered not only this offseason, but the last couple off seasons, which primarily justifies the reasons as to why I approach my drafts as such. Additionally, this draft guide comes with rankings by position: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defense by tier, half PPR, full PPR, 4 point per passing touchdown, 6 point per passing touchdown. Those rankings are updated every single week. If you guys have already signed up, be sure to check your spam email because I did send out an email. It is titled Andrew Kiorkof Updated Draft Guide, so keep an eye on that because the updated rankings are always coming your way. Additionally, the rankings don't stop this off season throughout the month of August. They'll continue every single Sunday morning as I will be sending you weekly rankings by position, by tier, by flex, half PPR, full PPR, in order to help you guys every single week to not only make decisions, but hopefully help you capture a 2023 fantasy football championship. For those of you who are wondering if you're eligible, be sure to check out the map to the right side of the screen. Your eligibility will be determined there. If you can go ahead, check out Underdog Fantasy, sign up using code Andrew, make that first time deposit, start drafting today, and gain some experience under your belt. Draft responsibly via Underdog Fantasy. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about our draft strategy here for today. Specifically, like I mentioned, I'm trying to draft the best available player every time I am on the clock. And I'm trying to construct a roster that has a strong foundation. So by the time I get to week 17, this roster can help me win on Championship Sunday. All right, so let's talk about the number one overall selection I made here. I went ahead with the number 6 overall pick, selected Cooper Kupp. Now, a matter of who you select is often, in my mind, going to be just as important as when you select them. Because if I go ahead and select a running back in this position, sure, it can be justified, but when we approach the 2023 season, selecting an early running back selection in the first round as to the matter of when is certainly going to play a factor as to whether I make that decision. Specifically because over the course of this offseason, we have seen the meta shift to a lot of wide receivers coming off the board, not only in the first round, but in the second round, which pushes a lot of running back depth down the draft board, which gives us more opportunities of collecting said running back depth, which in my opinion leads me to selecting the best overall player But not only that, a wide receiver, because I know there are going to be running backs in future rounds that I can invest in that are certainly going to lead me to success. So specifically, we take Cooper Kupp here. Now, I don't really have to convince you to take Cooper Kupp. We've talked about it already this offseason in the idea that last year, he was just as good as he was in 2021. From weeks 1 through 9 prior to his injury, averaged 20.31 fantasy points per game, was the number 1 overall wide receiver in fantasy points per game on average throughout that span of time last season. He is an elite level talent, and even when Matthew Stafford did not play well last year, he was still good enough to get the ball towards Cooper Kupp, despite the fact that, of course, Matthew Stafford had that elbow injury, had the neck injury, all of that compounded on top of each other. Cooper's Kupp was still relevant. I know a lot of people are doubting his potential upside considering the hamstring injury, his age, but you got to remember, in the last 29 games that this man has played, including the playoffs, 24 of those games have consisted of 15 or more half PPR fantasy points, and only one of those games have consisted of less than 10 fantasy points. Just putting that into perspective, when he's healthy, he is an absolute monster. Now, besides the point of that, let's talk about the statistics that kind of revolve around first round selections, because the primary reason as to why I'm selecting Cooper Kupp is because I believe without a doubt in my mind, he is going to finish as a top 12 flex player by the end of the season. He is going to be amongst running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends, top 12 at a base minimum in terms of fantasy points produced for me over the course of the season. Otherwise, why would I invest my overall first round pick in him unless I knew I was going to get the best available player that is going to score the most fantasy points? So when we go ahead and look at the positional distribution of the top 12 flex in a half PPR scoring format over the course of the last 3 seasons, it is a very, even distribution in terms of running backs to wide receivers, 17 running backs, 16 wide receivers, very close percentage. And of course, at least one tight end within the top 12 each of the last 3 seasons, of course, twice being Travis Kelce and once being Mark Andrews. So when I approach my first round, of course, I want to select someone that is going to be in the conversation of being a top 12 flex option. Now, in this specific draft that I had on screen that I will once again transition back to, there were 7 wide receivers selected in the first round and 4 running backs with 1 tight end. The last time we have seen 7 or more wide receivers finish in the top 12 flex in a half PPR scoring format in the last decade was 2015. And that was actually the only time that it has happened where it's been 7 or more wide receivers. That is a really rare instance. And in that year, well, the best running backs were Devontae Freeman, Adrian Peterson, and Doug Martin. It was not a good year for running backs. So unless we're anticipating something like that, we are seeing a lot of stock being put into wide receivers early on in our drafts, which in my mind, again, is continuing to push the running back position down the board. Now, on top of it, something that I mentioned in my early round draft strategy video that I put out a couple weeks ago is the fact that the running back position in comparison to the wide receiver position over the last 3 years, when we talk about running backs that were in the top 12 of their position, that once again repeated, in comparison to wide receivers that were the top 12 of their position and in the following year once again repeated, there's a higher likelihood of running backs accomplishing that over the last 3 seasons than wide receivers. So again, when we see a lot of wide receivers that were in that top 12 conversation last season being taken in that first round, there is going to be very few spots based on the history of fantasy football in which wide receivers can get back to that territory. That being said, we approach the second round. I've taken my first round stud and I just let the draft come to me. Again, a lot of wide receivers are going to come off the board. We're anticipating, of course, Travis Kelce to be selected. But by the time he comes back to me in the second round, Derrick Henry is still available. A quarterback comes off the board. That's perfectly fine. We anticipate second round quarterbacks to typically come off the board. And I'll justify that by taking a quarterback in the third in just a moment. But in regards to taking Derrick Henry in the second round, it's an easy selection. He's the 7th running back off the board. I get him in the second round. I have him ranked higher than my 7th overall running back. And in this current position, he is the best overall player. Because after the selection of Derrick Henry from myself, the next best players were Jalen Waddle, Chris Olave, and Devonta Smith. And I don't believe in any world in a half PPR scoring format are those 3 receiving options going to outscore Derrick Henry this season. I'm trying to set myself up with the most fantasy points that I can possibly score within a given year. And when we're talking about a running back who has finished as the number 3, number 2, and number 4 overall running back in the last 3 healthy seasons, was the number 1 overall running back in fantasy football prior to his season-ending injury in 2021, we're talking about a top-tier player. And I understand he's getting up there in age, but age is just a number when we're talking about a Hall of Fame freak of a running back like Derrick Henry, a guy that since 2019, since Ryan Tannehill took over, has been averaging 20.38 fantasy points per game in the last 44 games that he has participated in at a healthy rate. There's a lot of upside here with Derrick Henry, and I automatically get him in the second round because, again, that running back depth is pushed downward. We love to see it because wide receivers are being selected so early. And due to the fact that I went ahead and selected Cooper Kupp in the first round, I've already established a little bit of wide receiver depth in the first. Now, when we approach the third round, we get into the conversation of Josh Allen and him still being available by 3.06, which in many instances is not going to be the case. But if in fact it is available to you, not only is he my number one overall quarterback, but somehow I managed to start my draft off with 3 players who in my mind are easily within the top 5 to 6 of their own position. I have Cooper Kupp very high. I have Josh Allen at the number 1, and I have Derrick Henry relatively high as well. So the fact that I can start my draft in this regard, taking the best available player, this obviously has to do with the fact that the other teams around me throughout this draft are selecting in a way to allow me to find this, potential success. But I'm just going to go ahead and roll with the punches. I'm not tunneling in on I need a second quarterback at this point, or I need more wide receiver depth. I'm taking the best available player, and at this current circumstance is Josh Allen. And like we've talked about already this offseason, like I've presented in prior videos, the drop-off in production at the quarterback position is extremely significant. And when you can take the positional advantage at the quarterback position, specifically with one of the top 3 guys being Allen, Mahomes, or Jalen Hurts, you should absolutely do so. Because like I've mentioned in the past, in the last 3 seasons, 2020 through 2022, we have seen 14 different performances from quarterbacks, which they surpassed 350 or more fantasy points in a season. That's 14 different instances in the last 3 seasons. When you look at 2004 to 2019, there were only 16 different instances where quarterbacks had 350 or more fantasy points. So that's 16 different instances in 16 years compared to 14 in the last 3 years. The quarterback position has changed. The upside is significantly higher. And when we're talking about Josh Allen, who, again, if that game did not get canceled last season against the Cincinnati Bengals in Week 17, he would have been the number 1 overall quarterback for 3 consecutive years. He is quite literally the only quarterback in fantasy football history who has produced 395 or more fantasy points in 3 seasons. No other quarterback has done it. The only other one that is even close is Patrick Mahomes with 2. And then we have like Peyton Manning with 1. And of course, Lamar Jackson with 1. And, this is a premier talent. And when I'm able to get him in the third and take the positional advantage, someone that has the potential of being a 400-point fantasy quarterback and has proven that in the last couple of years, why wouldn't I take that advantage? Now, when we move on, we get to the 4th round. And like I've mentioned already, the running back position continues to get pushed downward. Now, as you'll see on screen, I'm quite literally the only team in this draft that takes a running back in the 4th round. Everybody else goes wide receiver or quarterback. And even though there's a position to run, it's not going to scare me into taking a wide receiver. I know I need wide receiver depth, especially in a league in which I need to start 3 wide receivers. But in a league in which you have 1 quarterback, 2 running backs starting, 3 wide receivers, a tight end, and a flex, there's 8 starting positions. I put far more significance in value in those 1-start positions, in a quarterback, in the potential of a tight end. And I absolutely, when given the opportunity of taking Joe Mixon as the 15th running back off the board, when you all know I have him within my top 12 rankings based on unimpeded volume of opportunity with no more Samaje Perine, the receiving upside, and the offensive line improvements that they've made, and the fact that this is one of the best offenses in the National Football League, the guy took a literal pay cut to stay with this organization because he knows that he'll find success here more than anywhere else in his career. Of course, it leads me back to the running back position. I did not want to leave it up to chance as to whether or not I'd have the availability of Joe Mixon in the next round. But a lot of the reasons as to why people continue to go towards wide receiver in these 4th rounds or continue to heavily invest in wide receiver is the drop off in production. But when you compare tight ends to running backs to wide receiver has far more depth. Running back certainly, cuts off relatively quickly. So if you are going to invest, you do that at a position in which you know you're grabbing the best available running backs to give yourself the depth that throughout the season you're going to require. They're going to be the biggest difference makers on your rosters, because even though, a lot of people are leaning towards the idea that running backs don't win you a championship anymore, I can assure you that they absolutely do. It's just people are afraid of the inherent risk of injury. And of course, backfields being, running back by committees in a lot of different circumstances, which leads to teams often being risk averse and trying to avoid them. That being said, besides the drop off in production, there's also the risk of, the running back dead zone, rounds 3 through 8. As you guys can see on screen, we've seen a lot of running backs come off the board in round 3, and then it gets completely cut off for about 2 rounds there. This all being said, when you look back at last season and the running back dead zone from rounds 3 through 8, when we look at Underdog ADPs from August 28th through September 5th of the 2022 season, there were 18 running backs selected throughout the span of time between rounds 3 through 8. Just in comparison to the draft that I had on board earlier, there was 21 running backs drafted between rounds 3 through 7. much less rounds 3 through 8. So just putting into perspective, a lot of people are far more comfortable digging into the RB dead zone, and I'll tell you why. Now, when we talk about these running backs and how they performed in 2022, we have the improved running backs for them: Jacobs, Chubb, Ramondre Stevenson, and of course Pollard. 4 running backs who either were identical to where they were drafted at the running back position based on their ADP, or improved or were even better than where they were drafted. All of them improved on their overall investment. Now, we had a bunch of other players like Connor, Etienne, Zeke, Dylan, we had Antonio Gibson, Dameon Pierce, all running backs that were at least 1 to 7 overall ranks based in comparison to where they were drafted. For example, last season in terms of ADP, Travis Etienne was the number 16 running back off the board on average. Last season, he finished as the number 17 overall running back. So that means he was within 1 rank of his overall selection as to where he finished. That's a pretty good investment. In my mind, that's almost identical to the return on investment that you made initially within that season. Now, there are some instances like Elijah Mitchell last season, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Rashad Penny, Breece Hall, J.K. Dobbins, in which they, sustained injuries, which forced these running backs to miss a high volume of time. And when you miss time within a season, of course, you're not going to rank amongst the best. So of the group, when we're talking about 4 that improved, 7 that were within 1 to 7 ranks of their overall draft position, and then 5 that dealt with injuries, we're talking about 16 of the 18 overall running backs in that dead zone that honestly were justified decisions. In some of those circumstances, you got unlucky, but in the rest of them, they were 1 to 7 ranks or they improved. So a lot of people are looking at the dead zone this year thinking, man, I can just wait and invest there. Me personally, I'll take the Joe Mixon, and I'll also double dip back into the dead zone because there are still running backs there that are being highly undervalued. Now, like I mentioned earlier, when we talked about the drop-off in production in comparison to wide receivers to running backs, the wide receiver position, especially when we get into the conversation of like the 25th best wide receiver in comparison to the 25th best running back, there is a huge difference in terms of contributions throughout a season on average over the course of the last 3 seasons based on the overall production of those positions. So when we go ahead and we approach the next round, my 5th round specifically, and I've gone ahead and selected Cooper Kupp, Derrick Henry, Josh Allen, and Joe Mixon. Of course, I know I need to address a wide receiver position. I know that it is something that absolutely needs to be on my team by at least this round or the next. If TJ Hawkinson on this draft board had fallen to me, I probably would have taken him. But he didn't. He didn't go a little bit later than his current ADP. I go and I take DeAndre Hopkins. Yes, this is the second Tennessee Titan, but he is the best available wide receiver that is, on the board. This is a guy that last year with Kyler Murray was averaging 17.88 half PPR fantasy points per game, and even with Colt McCoy was averaging 12.6 half PPR fantasy points per game. We all know that Ryan Tannehill is a better quarterback than Colt McCoy. There's a reason why Ryan Tannehill helped A.J. Brown in 2019 and 2020 be a relevant fantasy wide receiver in both those years, being top 12 in terms of wide receiver rankings. There is upside here with DeAndre Hopkins, and I know he's getting older. That is a given. Every running back, every wide receiver, they're all eventually getting older, but at this current moment in time, that's the best available player, and one that I absolutely need to address based on the fact that I need wide receiver depth, and of course, the run had come and gone, and I went with running back. Now, as we continue throughout this draft, like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to jump right back into the running back kind of dead zone and invest in a running back, a player that is absolutely going to be my flex starter for the entirety of the year, because when you're playing in a half PPR scoring format, opportunity leads to success, and the more volume of touches you have, the higher likelihood for fantasy points that you have in the overall spectrum of fantasy football. Running backs in a half PPR have a positional advantage, especially running backs like a Miles Sanders, who's a 33 down back this upcoming season, who is going to get himself 40 to 50 receptions. With that all packed in to the fact that this is going to be a run-first football team with a rookie quarterback, the fact that I'm able to get him in the 6th round when I know he's going to be a top 15 back this season, again, another one of these investments I want to make, especially when we look at Miles Sanders' career going back to 2019. Anytime he's been given 15 or more opportunities in a game, being targets and rushing attempts combined, the guy's averaging 15 fantasy points per game in the last 32 contests. So there is a relevancy there. So once we've gone ahead and addressed our 2 wide receivers, 3 running backs, of course, one of them being a flex, and our quarterback, the next conversation kind of shifts towards what are we doing with tight end? We haven't addressed that position yet. We could have taken Hawkinson if, in fact, it had fallen to us to the DeAndre Hopkins round, but then that would have shifted everything else. Now, I distinctly remember this draft, and I remember going and clicking the star next to Darren Waller's name because I knew he was going to fall to me, and I was going to be able to snag him and just be perfectly fine, and this draft was going to be legendary. But unfortunately, it came to the point where I walk away from my computer having started Darren Waller. I come back and Mike Evans is on my roster. I probably would have taken Dallas Goedert at this position. Taking that tight end advantage, like you'll see in just a moment as I'll present another draft, taking the tight end advantage, especially in someone like Dallas Goedert, who last season, if he had not gotten injured, was going to be a top 5 tight end easily. And when we've talked about the drop-off in production earlier on when I presented that graphic, when you look at guys that are in that kind of top 6 to 7 tight end range, unless you're going to grab one of those guys, punt the position and let it rip and go and wait for someone to have a breakout season off the waiver wire and pick that guy up. That is typically the play. But in this current circumstance, you need to grab Dallas Goedert here. You need to have that additional tight end support because, like I mentioned earlier, one of your 8 starters is a 1-start position, which is that tight end, and that's 12.5% of that starting lineup overall. So if you can get that positional advantage there, boom, you're in a perfect spot. If Darren Waller falls one more, it takes that while I'm out of the room and we're good to go. But either way, you take a tight end here in your base core of foundation of players. The nucleus of your team consists of 3 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a quarterback, and a tight end. And then at that point, I can comfortably sit back and take a wide receiver 3 with anybody henceforth. Because in a league in which you're just filling in a wide receiver 3 every week, someone that you can play matchups with, someone that you absolutely can find a breakout on the waiver wire, or a rookie that ends up stepping up, why not just go ahead and do that with the wide receiver 3 position rather than one of your other primary core positions that are just as valuable, if not more, especially tight end and quarterback over the course of a season being a consistent fantasy option. Let's move on to another draft that I went ahead and conducted. This time, I'm in the number 1 overall draft spot. I don't know if you guys can see it clearly, but the number 1 overall pick, I take Justin Jefferson. Of course, I want to make the best possible decision, take the best available player, and I believe that's Justin Jefferson. What I end up doing in the 2nd and 3rd round should be illegal. I might need to be locked up for this. I somehow managed to find myself in a position where Derrick Henry and Jonathan Taylor are still available in the 2-3 turn. This can be considered a take the best available player. This can be considered, double hero RB strategy. I don't know what you want to clarify it as or quantify it as, but I opted away from drafting Josh Allen when I have an opportunity of getting 2 top 10 running backs, if not 2 top 5 running backs based on their overall potential alongside the best wide receiver in fantasy football. Now, when we get to the 4th round, we're in a position here where prior to that, we have 6 quarterbacks already off the board, with Hurts going, Mahomes going in the 2nd as well, with Josh Allen and Lamar in the 3rd, and of course, Justin Fields and Burrow in the 4th. That leaves me in a position to where I'm either going to be selecting elite level quarterback play and take someone in the 4th like Justin Herbert, or let him go, and then Trevor Lawrence, Justin Herbert, they're all gone, and I have to sit there and hope that someone like Dak Prescott or Deshaun Watson or Tua Tagovailoa can be relevant enough or improve their overall positional play to make the drop-off in production, that much less significant. So instead, I opted to take the best available quarterback in my mind in a position that I needed. I followed with a wide receiver, the best that I thought, and then I once again dipped back into the running back position, taking David Montgomery in the 6th, and then I followed up with Dallas Goedert in the 7th. Very similar approach. Obviously, selecting from the number 6 spot compared to the number 1 spot is a huge difference maker. You're going to be selecting, specific players at different times based on where they're drafted on ADP or what, people do in your leagues. But in this current position, it's kind of the same idea where I want to have 2 stud running backs. I want to draft a stud wide receiver. I want a good quarterback. I additionally want to have depth at wide receiver relatively early, but I'm also going back in to draft the running back in that dead zone that I believe is often being undervalued. First time around, it was Miles Sanders. Second time around, we're going back for David Montgomery, who has one of the easiest strength of schedules at the running back position, like I posted on yesterday's video. Follow it up with a tight end like Dallas Goedert, who in my mind is the 6th ranked tight end going into this season, ahead of guys like Kyle Pitts, who is often being drafted after them. I'm in a pretty comfortable position filling in that wide receiver 3 for the remainder of the year. I don't need to go heavy there, but maybe we'll try that out in the next coming days. That's going to cover for me today, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for watching. This was the number 1 draft strategy going into the 2023 season, where I'm building the foundation of my team on the pillars of stud running backs, wide receivers, a quarterback, and a tight end, covering my base. Because once I do, I don't have to worry about having to get a stud, tight end off the waiver, having to, hope that I can find this year's Jared Goff or Geno Smith. I have the quarterback that is going to run me into the remainder of the season. Should all grab a second one for bye week purposes. But everything in this, approach once again in this second draft, in my mind, once again clicks in and finds itself some successful, overall drafting. All right, let me know what you guys think down in the comment section in regards to this approach. Again, for those of you who want more information regarding the early round draft strategy that I've utilized already in this video, and I have kind of gone over and detailed more in my early round draft strategy video, be sure to check that one out. Outside of that, be sure to click the like button down below. Subscribe if you have not yet already. Again, we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the season. The next couple of days will be other draft strategy videos that I will be utilizing in order to give you guys a little bit more of an understanding as to how I'm approaching my drafts based on different positions and or potential different strategies that we might want to utilize. Maybe we don't draft the best available player. Maybe we say, hey, we are drafting 3 wide receivers back to back to back. We'll see how that works in the coming days. Either way, also don't forget to check out Underdog Fantasy. For those of you who have not yet already, use code Andrew. Make that first time deposit minimum of $10. Help me help you as you'll get my draft guide, my draft rankings, updated every week for the month of August. Additionally, rankings from weeks 1 through 18 every single Sunday morning to help you guys win. Of course, you can also draft and play via Underdog Fantasy today to gain experience prior to your upcoming leagues. Thank you everybody for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.